So now I'm going to show up the shark hazard mitigation strategy developing in Brazil. So this is actually a non-lethal approach to shark hazard mitigation. So Recife, it might be one of the highest shark bite rates per unit of area in the world. The spread of shark attacks started in 1992. Before that, it was quite typical that people used the water for water sports, scuba diving, surfing, everything. But since then, 67 bites occurred, an average of 2.1 bites per year, and this resulted in 27 fatalities of nearly 40%. And all these occur in a roughly 30 kilometer stretch of coastline. So this might be the thing that distinguishes the Recife case study from the other regions, is because we have a very restricted, identifiable, dangerous area. So it's sort of easy to deal with. So main responsible species were tiger shark and bull shark as well, similar to Reunion. And all this coincided with the construction of the port of Swap, which locates 30 kilometers to the south of the sea. So I'm going to show where Recife to ascend on northeast of Brazil. And this is an aerial view of the other those areas. So it's densely populated. We're talking about 3 million people in the metropolitan region of Recife. So what we feel that happened. So you see the Swap port in the south. So it was built on a large estuarine complex. So this construction required some rivers to be barriered. So great change to the local environment. We don't have any data whatsoever before all this happened. So we can only speculate that it will be home for bull sharks. And we have the prevailing currents and into north. So what we feel that occurs is that all the marine traffic that started in those years sort of has attracted sharks closer to inshore. And if the sharks would be moving north, then they would necessarily get to the sea after departing the Swap port. So the sea is also has lots of estuaries discharging in the coastal area, and so once the sharks would be nearby, they will probably be attracted by the presence of these estuaries. Furthermore, running parallel to the coastline, we have this peculiar topography which shapes a channel-like structure along shore. You can have a better look in this bathymetric profile. So deep blue is deeper water and light blue is lighter shallow water. So our idea is that if sharks would enter that channel, they would most likely be restricted in their movements, crossing all the shore close to the beaches. So it would be difficult for them to move offshore across the channel. So they would probably run along shore close to the beach, and which would increase the likelihood of them finding someone in water. So what we thought is that we did want to prevent sharks from accessing the shore. So we wanted to intercept sharks before they did get there. And so we deployed 2 systems. We just deployed the first shield, let's call it like that, made of long lines. So 100 look long lines, 2 long lines placed over here. And then further inshore, we would deploy drumlines, a set of drumlines to the north and to the south. So the idea would be to intercept sharks before they get inshore. It is the drumlines, but still kicking some fishy effort closer to the beach, should any shark bypass the first shield, and so we would still need to, it would still need to be caught before it fights somebody. Then the idea would be to translocate those sharks further offshore to the release. We didn't want to release them side because we didn't know what would happen, and we just imagined assembling a swimming pool, a tank, on the deck of the boat, and just transport it offshore for as long as possible, to be released. So this was a try and failure process. Like first, we would be very careful, analyzing the shark health and deciding when to release it based on itself. And at some point, we got confident, and we defined a 25-meter limit for the shark to be released. So sharks would be released in waters deeper than 25 meters. So we had two boats involved in the operations. The boat above would be the main boat, where the fishing gear would be deployed, the shark would be boarded, and the second boat would be the auxiliary boat that would continue the operations in case we got a shark and needed to transport it offshore. So during the time, we did lots of things to keep shark mobility. So we built a ramp to facilitate bringing sharks on board while minimizing the risks. And so it worked pretty well. And here you have a feature of a bull shark being transported already with its tags. So while the transportation was being made, we were taking all the biological samples that we needed and tagging the shark. On the background, you can see the city, so we are at some distance by now. And also, during the first years, we also optimized fishing gear so that we could increase the survival of common species. So we tested the effects of circle and the J-style hooks. And circle hooks, of course, they showed better performance, and we only use circle hooks instead. And we also made some comparisons about selectivity by comparing hooks deployed on the floor, on seafloor, and hooks suspended in mid-water. And the hooks in mid-water, they revealed to capture less bycatch, so they were more selective for sharks. And so we only use circle hooks and hooks deployed in mid-waters instead. So the fishing operations from the program started in May 2004, but actually the first few years were little, so nothing was known about the coastal ecosystem, namely regarding the marine megafauna. So we needed to do lots of biological analysis to find out if we are dabbing pregnant bull sharks, for instance, that would be using the area for laying their pups. That was not verified, so no pregnant bull sharks during the whole program. And so in 2008, we turned to the non-lethal strategy. So fishing was conducted 5 days per week, between Fridays and Tuesdays. This was a reflex of beach usage. So during these 5 days, we had more people using the beach and the ocean. And the program, it ran until the end of 2014, and we accumulate the fishing effort of over 500,000 hooks deployed. And if you see the catch composition, you see that we got like 60% of kilios, but these were mostly catfish, which are quite abundant over there. And the elasmo ranks, they comprise 40% of the capture, with a residual number of sea turtles. Regarding the potentially aggressive sharks, the raucous component were tiger sharks, with a total of 95 individuals caught, and bull sharks, with 19 individuals caught. Actually, bull sharks were more common during the first years of the program, during the lethal phase of the program, before 2008. And since then, they became rarer and rarer. So this is very similar to what is occurring here in Reunion, and this kind of signal has been observed as well elsewhere. So we believe that we produce a sort of a localized stock depletion here around Recife. And so bull sharks are not frequently seen nowadays. Tiger sharks, on the other hand, they are more common. And this species have been confirmed, we implicated in the incidence with forensic analysis. Other species are present as well, but we don't believe they would have so much relation with the shark bites. Like a black-tip shark, for instance, there might be some incidents involving this species, but probably not so serious, and they are never identified as being forensically identified as being involved in incidents. So it's worth noting that the few sharks had been caught on drumline. So the first shield was apparently operating well, although bull sharks, some number of bull sharks have been caught on drumlines. So this is also a reflex of their behavior, inshore behavior. Bull sharks, they tend to approach land and even estuaries and rivers, in contrast with the tiger sharks, which are not known for occupying those islands. Regarding fishing mortality, so we have like a low mortality of most elasmobrach species, with the exception of black-nosed shark. So this is a small pecarity, which shouldn't have much implication in the shark bites, and it was a sensitive species, so unfortunately it died frequently during the pond lines. Protected species like nurse sharks, which are protected in Brazil, Goliath grouper, turtles have virtually zero mortality, and the global relative mortality was around 23%, but this was mostly shaped by the catfish mortality, which was 25%, and it was by far the most evident species caught. So regarding hooking location, most of the hooks were lodged on the corner of the mouth. So what you see as external over there means that it was lodged in the mouth and not in the butt or elsewhere. So going back to our mitigation strategy, so intention was to capture the sharks before they get to the hazardous area and translocate them to be tracked after being released. To track the sharks, we use a combination of satellite tags and acoustic tags. So satellite tags would tell us about wide-ranging movements that the sharks would make anywhere they would go, while acoustic tags would be useful to learn if the sharks would return to the place where they were caught off Recife. We set up an array of acoustic tags right in front of the beaches of Recife, inclusively inside the channel, and those acoustic receivers would detect any tag shark that would approach the area. But what we concluded is that translocated sharks did not return to Recife after being released, so we didn't have no acoustic detections, except for a couple of individuals that were eventually detected over 6 months after being released. And satellite tracking show us what the sharks were actually doing after being released. So here is an example. In the upper panel, you have the first 2 hours of the shark after being released, and then in the middle panel, the first 24 hours of the same shark, and in the panel beneath, we have the first 2 weeks. So if you look at the graphics, you can clearly see that in the middle plot, the range of the vertical movements is increasing with time. This indicates that shark was moving on the continental shelf, but in the offshore direction. At some point, at around 60 meter isobate, which is the depth of the shelf rape, the shark changes its behavior and starts decadizing. So this indicates that it's on the continental slope, so it's no longer on continental shelf. and it stayed there for some weeks, as you can see in the bottom tunnel, until it eventually returned to continental shelf, and probably in another region, not close to Recife, as you can see. This is another example. So clearly the shark is increasing the amplitude of vertical movements until it dives up to 200 meters in depth, indicating of oceanic habitat, and then it returns to continental shelf. This is vertical habitat, but we also have horizontal movements. So here you can see that the yellow line, it depicts the movement of the shark itself, and the red line, the red dots, are the position of the tag after it detaches from the animal and floats to the surface to transmit all the collected data. So after we release, the shark moves north and then starts streaming the data in a different state. So you see, like, I would say 200 kilometers up north. We had several examples of sharks moving north after being released. I'm just going to showcase a few examples. Of course, there were longer tracks and shorter tracks, and that to the movement of the shark will be longer or shorter, depends on the duration of the tracks. But most of the sharks really move to the north. Some remain more associated with the continental shelf. Other sharks move to the oceanic rill and did wide-ranging movements. We have several examples over here of such movements. A few sharks, although they did move to the south, but no shark stayed around the region of Recife. Here you have the pop-up locations, so the locations where the tags detached from the animal, to summarize a little bit where the sharks ended up after their tracks. And so most sharks were tens or 100 kilometers away from Recife when the track was finished. And here we have an example of a successfully tracked bull shark, which was released off Recife and did also wide-ranging movements to the south in this case. So we went south to Rio de Janeiro and went back north to Bahia at some point. So the tag actually detached inside of an estuary in Bahia. So we were confident by this point that sharks would not return to Recife after being translocated and released. And here I'm showing you a calendar of our fishing operations and days where incidents occurred. So in blue we see the fishing periods when we were away, and in white you see the periods where we were on hold waiting for funding renewal visually. So red squares represent attacks while we were on hold, and yellow squares represent attacks while we were operating. So here you have one example of an incident that occurred while we were operating, but we had just started the operation recently after being on hold. And here you have another reported incident that occurred while we were operating, but this actually should have corresponded to a drowning because several eyewitnesses said that the victim was getting drowned, and eventually it was attacked after being drowned. So it was found on the next day with bite marks, but we believe it was actually a scavenging episode. So it's very interesting to see that all the red squares, all the victims appear while the periods where we were on hold. And this is represents a little bit of effective decisions by our funders, because they actually they let us stop our work and would release funding just after the incident occurred, which is accumulating spendings, like a day after the socioeconomic impact of the incidents, they would still spend the money they would give us anyways. So this actually the big step, the continuity, the value of continuity of these sort of mitigation programs. Without the continuity, we're gonna accumulate the socioeconomic impact and still the costs of running such a programs. So what this tells us about our success in reducing shark bite rates? So during the 31 months since 2004, while we were on hold, so no fishing, we have 11 bites corresponding to 0.36 attacks per month. And during the 100 months while we were operating, we had 1 bite. So this corresponds to a 97% reduction in shark bite rate. And if you want to count with this scavenging episode, it would still be over 90% reduction. So this sort of shows the effectiveness of the program. And it's worth noting that this value, 0.36, is very similar to the previous shark bite rate before the program was implemented for 2004, which it was roughly 0.3. So it's compatible with the situation with no fishing at all would be conducted. Also, if you look at the monthly variation of the capture per unit effort, we show some compatibility between our results, the monthly distribution of our captures, which tended to rise during the first semester and drop during the second semester, and it followed similar trends than the shark bite distribution per month. So this resulted in a significant correlation and strongly suggests that the catches of the shark mandatory program reflected the evidence of sharks responsible for the bites, which means that we were actually removing the sharks that would otherwise inflict the bites. So, as I told you, in 2015, the shark mitigation program was discontinued for several reasons, and it has not been resumed since then. So we have been accumulating further incidents since then. So 8 incidents with 2 fatalities occurred since 2015. In 2023, we have 3 episodes within 2 weeks only. So hopefully the local government will re-implement the shark mitigation program, although it will be very difficult because all the logistics and the team and the capacity we must raise to conduct such an operation, you cannot do it from one day to the other. You need lots of times to do it. So let's see what's going to happen. In conclusion, so the shark hazard mitigation program greatly reduced the shark bite rate with relatively small environmental impacts. So terrestrial potential aggressive sharks seems to be an adequate strategy because of Recife. Bull sharks were more abundant in the first years of the program, so this suggests localized soft equation, as mentioned here before, and tiger sharks became more common in more recent years. So the non-lethal strategy not only reduced shark hazard, but also enable us with the acquisition of valuable ecological data. So we are nowadays more capable of describing the life history of the tiger shark in the South Atlantic. It was mostly focused on tiger shark because we cannot catch bull shark anymore to see what's going on with them. More or less like you guys have obstacles here. And it should be highlighted that the temporal continuity of the preventive operation should be maintained because it's a key aspect contributing to the success of this kind of programs. With this, I thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions.